So for a while now, there have been rumors that Nvidia is going to refresh the 40 series lineup. And I think this week we saw some leaks artwork of a 4070 Ti Super. And it looks as though there's going to be a few products that are possibly going to be announced at CES 2024, which is in early January. The leaks at the moment are talking about a 4080 Super. They're talking about a 4070 Ti Super. I don't know, a Ti and a Super. It's kind of like Ghostbusters. The streams shouldn't be crossing in that way.
A Ti Super, yeah.
Yeah. It's either Ti or Super. Both is kind of like, has severe implications for the space-time continuum.
It's like putting GTX and RTX together.
Yeah, the GT RTX.
The GT RTX.
And there's going to be a 4070 Super. The specs have been leaked, and what can you say? All of them are kind of like iterative upgrades. The 4070 Super actually looks to have the biggest increase in CUDA cores, possibly 7,168 versus 5,888. Elsewhere, it's, I don't know, I guess they're all sort of small iterative upgrades. The 4080 Super.
Dude, the 4080 Super really needed to be closer to 4090, I feel.
Oh,
maybe halfway between 4080, 4090, something like with this kind of. It just doesn't feel like it's going to be a significant enough upgrade in this regard.
Well, the leak's talking about 10,240 versus 9,728. That's not that much of a difference.
No,
right?
This is 3070 Ti territory for me. Which is fine. That's what I can think of. I think the 4070 Ti Super and 4070 Super are more interesting. But it really depends on your use case. Like the 4070 Super, it could have a lot greater shading power, and it could bring it more in line with and above the 3090 at times. I think that's what you would get from this, in terms of just raw performance in a game. I think that's what it could potentially do. But once again, 12 gigabytes of VRAM. Again, it's great if you're at 1440p, but at 4K, not every title is going to like it to the same degree. So it really depends on what you're doing. The 4070 Ti Super gets rid of that issue. 16 gigabytes is by far enough for 4K, I would say.
I think that's the problem, though, Alex. Why does a Ti Super have to exist? There should just be one, and it should be the Ti Super, but it should have called the Super. I don't know.
My guess is that the Supers are going to replace the cards that are directly beneath them, right? So the 4080 Super replaces the 4080, etc., etc. And if you look at the lineup of what dies are being used, it is essentially much the same. The difference being the 4070 Ti Super, where it is actually getting the more advanced chip.
Right.
So at least it's a little bit super.
I think DF support Busy Tracks, puts the nail on, hammers the nail on the head. And he says, what would you all consider to be fair prices for GPUs? We all roll our eyes at a $1,200 4080, but the 3080 at $699 felt like great value. Hopefully with the Super Ti cards, this generation can become more affordable. If we go back to the last time the Super name was rolled out, it was for Turing, right? Which very similar to 40 series in many ways, in that they came out and they were expensive cards. It's like I think the 2070 was like $530, which was kind of nuts. So maybe this is the whole reason behind a refresh is to kind of rationalize the pricing. So, if you're looking at the 4080 Super and it's, on the face of it, it's not that much different to the 4080. It does seem like the only vector to make this an appealing product is to actually reduce the price. And similarly with the 4070 Ti Super, it kind of needs to be, that was originally a 4080 card, but, with a different memory allocation, but a completely different chip. And I think they're basically trying to do a bit more in that pricing bracket. Hopefully they'll reduce the price. 4070 Super, similarly, right? I mean, the 4070 is already facing stiff competition from the 7800 XT, so they've got to do something there. It's interesting to see the cards that aren't being replaced or refreshed. 4090 stays where it is, and it's still, why would you want to refresh it? I guess, it's still light years ahead of the 4080. And basically elsewhere, 4060 range remains the same. And I think there's been some organic changes to pricing there already. So I think it is all down to pricing, and this has been your number one issue with 40 series, right, Alex?
Yeah, it's just I've said it before. I want that console and better performance at a lower price point, and it just doesn't happen here. I mean, the 4070 Super, if you're getting that for the 4070 price, I don't know, that could be interesting.
It looks like a reasonable increase in compute power, right?
Yeah, and that's really where you usually see the differences, because it's usually like trading blows with the 3080 and like falling below it at times, right? So if you could get that to be better in a lot of cases where it's just always better no matter what, it's a pretty great GPU in terms of performance. And especially since like just recently showed Alan Wake 2, like it's going to scale a lot better the more titles that we get like later down the line, just to architectural advantages. Like Alan Wake 2, 4070 base is really doing a number on the RTX 3080 there, even though like the RTX 3080 and like pure rasterization and less intense RT titles actually may be better. So that's really cool. But like, once again, it's all about this price, and I don't necessarily trust Nvidia enough to actually reduce prices here in a meaningful way. So with
I think they've got to get the price. I mean, the 4080, I mean, it's just at $1,200. It's just definition of unappealing.
Yeah, man, I don't know if I've ever seen anyone with an RTX 4080 out there. I always see people like, yeah, I got a 4090, or I've got a 4070.
I think Don's got one, hasn't he?
Oh, poor Don. Sorry, Don. Am I joking? Joking about John's rigs here? Don's rigs, yeah.
I mean, it is going to be about the pricing, in my opinion, but it does look like some interesting, albeit iterative, bumps to performance. But it's all about getting that balance of price versus performance sorted. And I mean, I guess they can make sort of just adjust pricing for the 4060s cards more organically.
Nice. More organically.
Yeah, I think,
I love the way you describe that.
Yeah, I think it is just basically the market in that sort of lower end tier just seems to have much more leeway for price adjustments, for sale pricing, for that sort of thing. You know, I've seen the 4060 for like $250, which, you know, even though it's an 8 gig card, which is a bit problematic compared to the 12 gig 3060, it's worth considering, right? So, yeah, I think it's just a case of trying to sort out price versus performance on those higher end tiers. And, I guess we'll find out in January, assuming that it is a CES announcement.
Sounds about right.
Anything more to add to that? I don't know. I think it's all right. I think one thing which is swiftly becoming the case is that I think frame generation's kind of established now. I think the latency hit is only really pronounced on the lower end kit. Only to the point where I think there's, once you're sort of getting really low latencies and maybe you're getting a 10, 15 millisecond hit, doesn't really make that much difference. I mean, you use frame gen all the time, right, John? On
Oh yeah, I just use it all the time, and it's basically not noticeable. I mean, yes, technically there can be a slight potential hit there, but for games that are demanding anyways, I feel like it just feels better with the higher perceptual frame rate versus no frame gen and a lower frame rate, right?
Yeah.
So
I think it's always worth using with VSync too. That's what I do.
There's also the idea of like consistency, and it's one thing we didn't really talk about. Like if you have since it's going to be taxing the CPU less, and you're going to have less variable. If it's a CPU heavy game, you're going to have like less variability in the raw input frame time. And you could actually get like a more consistent experience with frame gen on than with it off, even though the frame rate internally is lower. That's one thing. That's why we always talk about capping frame rates in games, why we like it, and why we advertise and say everyone should do it. And not everyone has to like that, of course, but that's one thing I think that is nice about frame gen is you get that, like, if you're like cruising at 116 FPS with frame gen on the entire time, it's great.
Yes, all right. I think it's quite ironic that we're advocating frame rate caps, which will also increase latency.
Yes, yeah, but consistency.
But nobody really says anything about it. I get exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think it's a balance, and I think just going for pure latency reduction alone at expense of everything else maybe in select circumstances. I think that's going to be up to the user, but for me, it's just not really worth it, right? You want to get the latency to a certain level, and then everything else, you got to bring it up. Get that. It's about consistency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this might be a heresy to the PC audience, but the other thing is that the input lag differential generally at high frame rates with frame generation is even less noticeable with a gamepad if you're using a gamepad as an input device.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
True.